I love the sound in the room. It sounds like there have been some, in addition to eating, some very nice conversations going on. However, we really are using every minute. So we're beginning the post-lunch presentations that are preceding the next dialogue session that will be where the conversation will be very much tied to the ideas that are shared by Melinda, Chuck, Michael, and Randy. Let me introduce each person. Melinda Marble is the Deputy Director at the Bar Foundation, overseeing their programs and the directions of their programs related to the priorities of the foundation. And many of you know that she was previously the Executive Director of the Paul and Phyllis Fireman Charitable Foundation. And in that role, she facilitated the planning process that led to what we are launching today. And previous to that, many of you know, she was one of the big brains behind the One Family campaign that has created the One Family Scholars, the campaign to end family homelessness in Massachusetts, and many, many other initiatives of the Fireman Foundation. We are so honored to have her here, sharing some of her thinking about fresh ideas that we need. Next to her is Chuck Collins, who is right now a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., but I'm sure many of you know he founded United for a Fair Economy and has been working for a very long time to bring intelligence and wealthy people to the table to change and make an impact on income inequalities in this country. And we are really pleased to have you here, Chuck. Next to Chuck is Michael Stone, professor and senior fellow in the Center for Social Policy, and my colleague. I'm so lucky to have Michael as a colleague. He is for over 30 years has been focusing on housing and has some very big ideas to share with you today about dealing with the tremendous disparities that exist in our country related to access to housing. And he is the author of many of the books and the recent analyses that are laying out on the table by the Center for Social Policy's stand over there. Next to Michael is Randy Albelda, economist, senior fellow with the Center for Social Policy. She is also a very big thinker, and her work, along with Michael's and that of many of you in this room, were, I would say, the seeds for reshaping poverty policy that we're launching today. I feel very honored to be a colleague of Randy's. So Melinda is going to start us off with a way of just thinking about the fresh ideas that are needed today.
Thank you, Donna. It's really wonderful to be here in a group of people who are committed to the families that we all care so much about. I was thinking about what to say today, and I was tempted to say something that I always hate when people say, which is the old thing that the Chinese character for crisis and opportunity are the same, so that in every crisis lies an opportunity. And I don't know about you, but in every crisis I've been in my life, I hate it when somebody points out the opportunity. It just feels like an awful thing to live through, and a sort of a disrespect of the pain and the real suffering that comes at times like these. But I do know from my own personal life crises and the social political ones I've seen that a crisis can be a good time to jettison some things, to blow some things up, to start over. And that's really what I think my function on this panel is to exhort us all to be thinking in that way. What can we leave behind? What can we throw away as we begin the work of dealing with what are bound to be very difficult times for families for some time to come? As Donna said, I've been working on the issue of family homelessness for the last 11 years, and I was lucky enough 11 years ago to get a job at the Fireman Foundation where I could pretty much do what I wanted. And what I wanted to do was find some incredible women and think with them about the problem of family homelessness, which was and remains a women with children problem by and large. And so many of the women around this room have been my thought partners in that work over the years. And we've had some successes, we've had some failures, but what we set out to do at the encouragement of our donor and trustee was to adopt a big, bold, gutsy goal of ending family homelessness. And we set out to try to create the political will, the practice change, and the kind of policy lens that would let us do that in this state. And I think 11 years later, we've changed some of the language. We have better data. We have a strong team of partners who are working on that, and for the first time we have a state government administration that's aligned with our goals, and still we don't have the outcomes we want. So taking the long view is also really critically important, but I can't think of better work to be doing, a better long view to have, and better companions to have to do it with. And some of our learnings from that process have been first of all, the importance of really putting families in all their wholeness and magnificence at the center of the work, and letting the stories and experiences of women who are going through homelessness drive our systems change work, drive the policy agenda, and everything else. For two reasons. One, in working directly with women is energizing and engaging and felt good and right and kept us in the work. But also, it gave us a much more fine-grained and detailed sense of what change needed to happen. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about in this country is how, for all of us, how much in America we frame poverty or see it through the lens as a moral issue. And so there are two storylines about families that I hear in the US when I go around and talk to people. Conservatives, people on the right, the storyline is those lazy, uneducated people made bad choices about their life. And the more compassionate conservatives might say they need to be taught how to make better choices. But there is a whole storyline that it's about somehow individual and personal choice. And now, and this may be a less welcome message, let's think about what our storyline as progressives is. Well, often it's, these are noble families who are oppressed by systems and have no control over their own lives. And sometimes when I hear that framing, even from my own mouth, I remember a poem of Richard Wilbur's about a bird in a cage. And in the poem he says, "We love the small, and if the small be not yet small enough, why then by hell we'll cramp it till it knows but how to feed, and we'll provide the water and the seed." And I think, unfortunately, that's been for too many of us for too long, the framework that we unconsciously fall into. And it's another way of buying the moral argument that we detest so much on the right. So one of the things I want us to encourage us to do is just practice changing our frame once in a while. And what if we begin changing the frame by using data and conversations and real informations about families? What if we look at it together? Friends, enemies, unexpected partners, and allies. I think if we look at what is really happening to our families together, I have a lot of confidence that I can convince anybody in the world that we shouldn't have perverse incentives, that we shouldn't encourage families to go into shelter, to give up their education, that we shouldn't cut people who are working and trying off from benefits too soon. So I think really examining our own frames and being open to putting on different lenses once in a while is really important. And I know my failures in this work have come when I don't do that. Second, so the power of looking at data together. And I think second is the power of building on strengths and assets. Often our storyline is a gloom and doom storyline. It's a storyline of things being done to that cramps my sense of families down smaller and smaller and really fails to take into account what they do every day just to get up and go to work and keep going. And I find when those stories are widely shared, there's a wider audience for the kinds of policies we want. The third real lesson for me from this work is the power of a big, bold, gutsy, unacceptable goal. And soul too, yes. As my husband's a writer, and he always says, all power to the imagination, and that is a big soul. For us, beginning the work on homelessness, I started out thinking about it as, well, we'll try to change a few things in the system. And my trustee at the Fireman Foundation said, don't talk to me about managing homelessness, let's talk about ending it. And for the first couple of years of One Family, I couldn't say that goal out loud without putting my hand over my mouth or sort of laughing and making a joke about it. But what I saw over time was the power of really aligning people around a very big vision, planning backwards from that vision and really looking at what would have to be in place to make it happen. There is a real power and energy that comes from working on something big and difficult, and then your job begins making it not so big and difficult that people panic and can't find the way forward, so that they stay on their growing edge. And one of the things that I've loved about the One Family initiative is it's asked of the women who've experienced homelessness, it's asked of state legislatures, it's asked of policymakers, and it's asked of ourselves from the beginning to make transformation that would be needed in order to meet this big goal. And in the process of seeing how difficult and clumsy and complicated the process of transformation is of individuals, systems, families, ourselves, I think that's brought us more deeply into the work. So those are just a few observations, somewhat abstract about change. But the final thing I'll say is, one of the things I love about big goals is just putting them out there and not having any secrecy or a hidden agenda about them. And I've been reading Gandhi a lot lately because I feel like he's someone we haven't learned nearly enough about the miracle that happened in India in the middle of the last, well, before that century. But one of the things Gandhi said, he was talking about not keeping plans secret from the power structure. And he said, you know, the end of secrecy in all our work will bring out very rapidly, more rapidly than anything else, the end of the Secret Service. And that's just something to think about. So thank you.
I mess up your slideshow if I'm up here, Randy. Well, I thought that was soulful. I'm Chuck Collins, and I've been very inspired by the work that Melinda and the One Family Scholars have done over the years. I'm just curious, how many One Family Scholars, connected people are here in the room? All right, let's give it up for the One Families. Thank you for being here. And, you know, as somebody, One Family Scholars members come to our church every year and courageously get up and talk about their own stories. And in the spirit of that, I thought, there was a slide here about speak up about poverty, speak out about poverty. I should speak out about privilege a little bit. So some of you know I'm the great-grandson of the meatpacker Oscar Mayer, which basically meant I won the lottery at birth. I was born on third base. But I was lucky in so many ways because as a teenager, I was with a friend of mine, Chuck Mathai, and we were in the Bowery, and I met a woman named Dorothy Day, who was the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. And Chuck introduced me as, oh, you know what, this is the hot dog guy. And Dorothy said in a very serious way, you know, you can overcome the circumstances of your upbringing. And inherited wealth is not a terminal condition. And so she urged me to not sort of just join the ranks of the undeserving rich and to try to break the intergenerational cycle of inherited wealth as best I could and look at issues of privilege. So I tried to take her admonition very seriously and worked over the years to try to overcome the deficits of my upbringing. And many of my teachers are here in this room. I remember Margaret Blood sat down with me when I was coordinating the graduated income tax campaign, and she just talked me through running campaigns in the city of Boston and some of the women at this table over here, Margaret Leonard and Nancy Schwer and others, they sort of helped me see some of the blind spots that those of us with overprivilege suffer from, and the cultural illiteracy, the missing the cues. That was one of the things I was found as an overprivileged person, not sort of picking up on things that were happening around me. And another thing they did was they helped steer me away from risky behavior, like investing in financial derivatives and that sort of thing. You can see where I'm going here. But it is not easy to overcome privilege. And I'm kind of riffing this way because I think part of what Melinda was saying and part of what I want to talk about is the stories, the way we think about poverty, inequality, wealth, we're very much captured by that. And the economic policies that flow in our country come out of the way we think. So, I've been working hard to overcome privilege, but I've realized now it's a multi-generational process, that my daughter, who's a teenager, she goes to the Boston Public Schools. She's a proud product of the Boston Public Schools. She speaks Spanish. She knows that she's not going to inherit any wealth. She's going to have to study hard and work work for a living. But even a lot of privilege continues to flow towards her still. I'm just amazed. And realizing maybe my grandchildren will finally be able to be better equipped to live in a society, an equal society, where what you do and how you live and your being is more important than where you're born and the circumstances of your birth. So the one thing I would say, though, is my overprivileged upbringing did help me with a few insights into the nature of inequality. And the one thing I would say privilege is a drug. Class, race, gender privilege is a drug. Through the fog of entitlement, through the highs, I actually think we believe that it's all about us, that the deservedness, that the good fortunes that come our way have something to do with us, and that we think we're doing it alone instead of seeing this vast web of people and nature and supports that make life possible. That's what the privilege drug does to people. It makes you forget that an injury, as Enid Eckstein would say, an injury to one is an injury to all. It makes you forget, as our religious teachings are, that we're all one body, that we're all connected, that our long-term interest for everybody is in an economy that works for everybody. So I say those things, personal things, which are true, because I don't think we're going to address the problems of poverty unless we tackle the deep mythologies about poverty, wealth, and inequality, and look at the systems, the machinery, if you will, that creates these inequalities. So we've been living through what I would call an economy that the powerful and privileged have organized, and it's the yo-yo economy, the you are on your own economy. And instead of an economy where we all move and work together, we have been living through, particularly the last 30 years, of an economy that the rules of the economy have been organized to funnel wealth to the top. It's not a nature event. It's not about individual effort or achievement. It's that the rules, the trade policies, the tax policies, the monetary, the rules of government, the rules of public policy have done a remarkable job of taking wealth out of the pockets of working people and putting it into the pockets and bank accounts and offshore accounts of people at the very top. So we've lived through a period of what I would characterize extreme inequality. And it's very difficult to talk about solutions to poverty in that context. And I won't belabor you with statistics, and I know that Michael and Randy they're real economists, so I'll leave it to them. But we know that the top 1% now has more wealth than the bottom 95% combined. We know that the real wages for most people in this country have been flat or falling for the last 30 years. We know that the median income, the median wealth of an African American household is 1/8 the wealth of a white or Caucasian household. These are mega trends that have big shifts that have happened really in a very short time. And they matter. And I think one of the challenges when we get into the discussion about poverty solutions is that we really need to also realize that to solve poverty, we need to redesign the whole machinery, the whole economy, so that it's an economy where there's shared prosperity and not extreme inequalities. I spent at United for a Fair Economy and now at the Institute for Policy Studies, and many of you have spent a fair amount of time talking about why inequality matters, that it matters how not only poverty obviously matters and the impact of poverty, but the concentrations of wealth matter. And a lot of people in the medical community now are showing us that you're better off living in a county with a lower median income, but that has greater equality, than you are living in a county that has a higher median income, but has extreme inequality. Now, why is that? This is a public health fact. There's the health disparities people have been talking about this, trying to get us to listen that inequality is making us sick. But why is that? It's because when a society pulls apart too much, there is a breakdown in solidarity. There's a breakdown in our sense that we're all in the same boat. And that people not only live maybe on other sides of the tracks in other neighborhoods, but live in parallel universes. And if you live in another universe from somebody, it's hard to believe that an injury to them is an injury to you. We know that these inequalities matter in terms of democracy. We can see what's happened when concentrated wealth drives the political agenda. And now we've gotten a crash course in how extreme inequality undermines economic health. I was going to do a human PowerPoint here, which I'll spare you of, but imagine that we've lined up the lowest income to the highest income folks right here at this front dais here. Actually, I'll give you a sign you can hold up. Melinda's the bottom fifth.
I was born in the right place.
Michael is the middle. Randy is the top 1%.
Hi.
You gotta get her.
Randy asked for that. So, you probably have seen the story, you know the statistics, you've probably seen that Melinda, real wages have fallen pretty much for the last 30 years. They're basically just getting back to the starting line. And Michael, the middle class, running harder, basically holding it together by working more hours and going deeper into debt. That's been how people have survived in this extremely unequal economy. They have worked harder, gone deeper into debt, taken on more jobs, and that is part of this story. But Randy, that top 1%, has seen most of the gains in both income and wealth creation. And so what does this have to do with the economic crisis? Well, when the bottom has to borrow to consume, when real wages haven't grown up, we've had an economic growth model based on borrowing, not based on real wages going up. And now, boom, the bubble bursts. But at the very top end, we've also seen this enormous concentration of wealth. And remember I was talking about risky behavior? At the very top, those who hold the vast amount of wealth, $17 trillion in wealth in 2006, that top 1%, moved a lot of that money into highly speculative investments. You couldn't get wealthy in the real economy. You had to go into the casino economy to really make your gains. So inequality is part of our problem here. Inequality is what's brought us to this moment in the economy. So let me just say three very brief implications for this for our work. One is I think the economic crisis changes the game. And Melinda alluded to this, that there's this crisis and an opportunity, but it has changed the game. And the bad news is there's going to be a world of pain in the making. It's happening. Part of our work is to tell those stories. Part of the work is to make that have a human face. I was with a group of economists earlier this week. We think of economists as kind of a sober group. This was a group of economists that were looking at the next 3 years, what's going to happen to the unemployment rate and what's going to happen to poverty rates. And we were crying. Because these are people who understand when you see a graph that shows that the unemployment rate in Michigan for African Americans is going to rise to 20% by 2011 under all projections. That the child poverty rates that we worked so hard to reduce in the 90s will climb again. And that poverty rate for African American children will go back to approaching 50%. Economists were crying because we know what that means. We know what that means in people's lives for children who are trying to go to school, for families trying to hold it together. And so we have a game-changing moment. This economic crisis is the rapidly changing context for our work. The second implication, I would say, is our solutions to poverty depend on what is our vision for the future economy, for the new economy. We are not going back to anything that we have known. We are not going back to 2006 or 1986 or 1966. Part of that's the planet's not going to allow us, the ecological constraints, the ecological change. We can't go back to an economy based on cheap energy. So we have to think about what is this future economy going to look like, and what does it mean for our goal of an economy that works for everybody? I would say that we are in deep shift. And we need to remake the economy based on, really think transformative. I found it useful to think about the last few years as we've been living through the casino economy. 40% of profits in this country came from the financial sector. That was basically money making money, squeezing more money out of the economy. And that there is a real economy where people live and exchange goods and services and make useful things. Wall Street has become the casino economy, Main Street the real economy. Wall Street, the creators of phantom wealth. Main Street, the creation of real wealth and health and sustainability. So one way we have to think about the context for our work on poverty is, where will the jobs of the future be? What will the economy look like? And I think all the stuff the environmentalists have been telling us is very relevant here. We want to have local energy. We want to have not big hydroelectric, dams, but local control over energy, local food systems. Food is not a foodie yuppie issue. Food is a food security issue. Where will the food come from that we will live on? Can we produce more of it here? Can there be new businesses? My office is in the brewery in Jamaica Plain. A lot of the new incubator businesses are food related. That's a good sign, I think. So we have some sense that the future economy is we need to build on what we know to be real. Energy, food, health, things that help strengthen the local economy. That's where the jobs of the future will be. The third point, and maybe the most controversial, is in this process of talking about poverty, we have to talk about wealth. We have to talk about the top, the concentration of wealth and power. So much of our conversation should be about the art of lifting the floor, of creating opportunity, of building ladders, but to realize that we're not going to get there unless we address this concentration of wealth and power problem. Some people say, well, doesn't that lead you down the road to talking about class warfare? And I always come back to Warren Buffett saying, yes, there's been a class war and my side is winning. Warren Buffett understands, and there are a lot of other people, and I go think back to what Hubie Jones said, there is a great disquiet about inequality. That was a very poetic way of saying people are really deeply, deeply troubled and disturbed at all levels of the society. And so we have to, when we talk about the state budget and the federal budget, part of what we need to talk about is taxing the top, restoring progressivity of the tax system. Since 1955, if you had the equivalent of $2 million of income in 1955, you paid about 50% of your income effectively in taxes. And last year it was about 17, 18% for households with incomes over $2 million. So we've seen a shift in who pays. And when Hubie Jones talked about the GI Bill and expansion of home ownership and some of the things that helped build the middle class after World War II, those were funded by a progressive tax system where not only did we reduce the concentrations of wealth, we generated the revenue to make the investments to lift the floor. So in conclusion, I'll say I hope that poverty advocates, that we not just think about how do we redesign the solutions to poverty, but how do we redesign the entire economy and how it works and who it serves. I think the biggest danger right now is we'll have a so-called recovery that looks like the 80s or the 90s when we were continuing to pull apart, but that the story, the larger story in the economy is everything's getting back to normal. If we will fail if the recovery does not address the racial wealth disparities and these poverty issues. So let's come together to work for an economy that works for everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chuck. And I really want to thank everyone who was involved in organizing this conference. It's just not only an enormous amount of work, but an enormous amount of creativity that's gone into this. I'm honored to be here, and I'm also very proud to be part of the Center for Social Policy, the work that we've done together, and to participate in this event today. I'm going to be echoing and reinforcing some of the themes that Chuck has talked to you about with regard to inequality, with regard to the relationship between the real economy and the casino economy, and the need for changes that not only focus on the circumstances of those at the bottom, but recognize the larger relationships, the integration of all pieces of our society and our economy, and the need to address them simultaneously with a particular focus on the problem of housing. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his second inaugural address, uttered his now famous lament, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed." 12 years later, 1949, the U.S. Congress set as a national goal a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family. In the 6 decades that have passed since the 1949 Act, 60 years exactly, the fraction of the nation that is ill-housed has declined very, very substantially, although still, sadly, we're far from every American family having a decent home and a suitable living environment. However, during this entire period, we have been and continue to be 1/3 of a nation shelter poor. 35 million households in this country, 100 million people, face such a squeeze between their incomes on the one hand and their housing costs on the other that they're unable to meet their non-shelter needs for food and clothing and medical care and personal care and so forth at even a minimal level of adequacy. Now, I'm not going to give you a lot of statistics about this. Donna mentioned some of the documents we have over there that'll give you plenty of numbers. But what I want to highlight is that of these 35 million households, that doesn't even include the hundreds of thousands more of our American compatriots who have no homes at all on any given night. Those 35 million households at least have roofs over their heads, even though they can't pay for their other needs at a basic level of adequacy. Shelter poverty is, of course, not equally distributed in our society. It's disproportionately borne by 3 overlapping segments of our society: those who rent, those households headed by a person of color, and those households headed by a woman. Overwhelmingly, shelter poverty is concentrated amongst these 3 segments, and of course, most severely amongst those women of color, both older women as well as women with kids who are renter households. Now, while shelter poverty, as poverty in general, rises and falls with the economy, getting somewhat lower in the best of times and higher in the worst of times, underlying these ups and downs, for more than half a century, over 30% of all households in this country have been shelter poor. Clearly, this is not a problem of an unfortunate few left behind by a pervasive economy of growth and prosperity. We have to look deeply to find its causes. Now, there are, in my analysis, 5 fundamental and interconnected elements that account for pervasive and persistent shelter poverty. Obviously, I can't give you much of an analysis of these, but I want to touch on them, each of them briefly, because they provide the foundation for the kind of changes and indeed the kinds of action that I think are necessary. The first of these is continuing segregation and housing discrimination. You know, there's a widespread view that discrimination in housing is largely a thing of the past, and the segregation is gradually disappearing, and will finally dissipate with people being concentrated in certain geographical areas just as a result of free choice. Well, none of that is true, as I'm sure all of you know well. Segregation has only modestly declined, and discrimination persists in the rental, sale, financing, and insuring of housing. The burdens are greatest for black households, but the evidence suggests that they're growing worse for Latino and Asian American households as well. Segregation and discrimination contribute to and perpetuate disparate shelter poverty for households of color, from both the income side and the housing cost side. Households of color, on average, get less for their money in terms of housing in neighborhoods than do white households of the same income. That is, households of color get less for more. They pay more and get less for it. Households of color are more likely to live in neighborhoods, in locations that have detrimental health effects, unequal educational opportunities, and transportation challenges to good jobs, all of which contribute to lower incomes, exacerbating shelter poverty from the income side, quite apart from the housing side. Second causal factor, wide and widening income inequality. I've heard Chuck talk about that as well as wealth inequality, but what are the consequences for housing? The first has been reduced affordability and rising housing prices. On the one hand, this has made it harder for most people to afford housing. But on the other hand, those at the top of the income distribution with more and more income have been driving up housing prices. Through speculation, through McMansions, through gentrification, through tearing down existing houses to build luxury houses, all of this has contributed to higher housing prices, just as most people have had less real income to be able to pay for housing. In addition, those at the top have not only, even though they've put most of their added income into financial investments directly, real estate, multifamily housing, apartment buildings, condos have been another source of investment, driving up rents in multifamily housing. The second major housing consequence of widening income inequality has been decreased ability for most families to save. What are the implications of that? One, this has meant that people who wanted to buy homes in the past might have been able to have had less money saved in order to make down payments. The consequence has been rising mortgage levels relative to house prices. That is, smaller and smaller down payments with associated increased risk, both for the homeowners as well as lenders, and additionally, higher housing costs associated with greater mortgage burdens. The other consequence of diminished savings is that because most middle-income households have not had money to put into savings accounts, the traditional lenders, traditional home lenders, the thrift institutions, the savings institutions, which used to be a fairly self-contained system financing housing and particularly home ownership, these institutions have had to turn to the capital markets in order to get the funds to lend for housing. And I'll come back to that, some of the implications of that in a few minutes. The third causal factor in this problem of shelter poverty and inequality in housing is treating housing as a speculative commodity. Nearly everyone, not quite everyone in this room, I'm sure, has come to believe that they're entitled to make a killing in residential real estate. Up and down the food chain. Not just distant investors, not just the intermediate mortgage packagers and nearby speculators and mortgage brokers who've been exploiting the situation, but I'm afraid we have to acknowledge far too many homeowners and home buyers have come to think of their homes as speculative investments instead of residences for themselves and their families. And all of this has been coupled with the idealization and over-promotion of speculative home ownership based on a whole series of myths that some of us are now coming to recognize in our daily lives. First, the myth that you're always better off as a homeowner than a renter. Myth number two, that homeownership is a sound and reliable way to build wealth. Myth number three, that property values always go up. at least as long as you can keep undesirable activities and undesirable people out of your neighborhood. Myth number 4, that homeowners are full citizens, real Americans, but renters are not. And the 5th and biggest myth is that homeownership provides the illusion of ownership through the reality of debt. That leads to item number 4, the overdependence on debt in the capital markets to finance housing. Because housing is costly to produce, and most producers are relatively small businesses, the construction of housing has largely depended on borrowed money. More significantly, though, because housing is a commodity and long-lasting, the transfer of houses, of course, is mostly financed with borrowed money, mortgage loans. But furthermore, because housing is a speculative commodity and the principal source, has been the principal source of wealth for most American families, housing has been the principal source of borrowing, even without transferring, refinancing and home equity borrowing, with all the risks and so forth that that entails. And so over the entire period since World War II, housing has been the largest single sector of the economy of using debt. No other sector of the economy has been as dependent on borrowed money, and the consequence is that for nearly all of us, 2/3 to 3/4 of what we pay for housing, and this is true for renters as well as homeowners, goes for mortgage payments. Combined with widening income inequality, major changes in the mortgage system, and more active and aggressive promotion of mortgaged home ownership in recent decades, this dependency on debt has been turned into an addiction. With debt pushers, yes, emerging at all levels because of enormous and growing opportunities for profit. And so this was an enormous storm that, if you'll pardon my mixed metaphor, blew apart the house of cards, in which certainly, once again, the disproportionate consequences have been borne by people who are renters, not just homeowners, and amongst both renters and homeowners, disproportionately borne by those of color and those households headed by women. The last category, number 5, is public policies that have actually far too often stimulated and exacerbated problems in the other 4 areas rather than ameliorating them. And I won't go into detail on this, but let me just identify a couple that are really significant. First, housing affordability policy. Since the 1930s, the focus of housing policy, especially at the federal level, has been the promotion of mortgaged home ownership. These supports have included institutions that support mortgage lending, the ideological promotion of home ownership at the expense of renting, and tax subsidies provided to homeowners. And let me say a bit about that, because it's going to be a significant part of the direction for change. In the current fiscal year, subsidies provided to homeowners through the U.S. Treasury amount to about $130 billion a year. And this doesn't include any of the new assistance for those facing foreclosure. This $130 billion subsidy program for homeowners is about 3 times as much as we spend for all low-income housing in this country. So we're spending about 3 times as much to subsidize home ownership as we are to subsidize rental. Furthermore, this subsidy program for homeowners goes to those with the highest income. It is totally upside down and regressive. About more than 2/3 of this goes to households with incomes of over $100,000 a year. If you're a homeowner with an income of over $200,000, you get a subsidy each year, a housing affordability subsidy, averaging about $10,000, pardon me, $10,000 a year. By contrast, on average, households with incomes of $50,000 or less get a subsidy of $1,000 on average. And for those at the top, it's an entitlement. Virtually everyone gets it automatically through their tax returns. While if you're, of course, a low-income person, it's not an entitlement. You've got to be on waiting lists, as most of you know, for years and years and years, and jump through all sorts of bureaucratic hoops just to get certified and continue to be certified to get low-income housing subsidies. And I'm focusing on this disparity, not only because of its fundamental unfairness, as significant as that is, but because it has contributed to widening income inequality, and because it provides perverse incentives for those at the top to speculate in housing, thereby making it worse for everyone else. At the same time, though, I'll come back to this in a moment, these home ownership subsidies do provide some lessons and opportunities for a new direction. The second major category is fair housing policy. All too correctly, probably we should call it unfair housing policy in many ways. Local policies, especially in the suburbs, have been unfair that have not only perpetuated but strengthened segregation, all too often not confronted and challenged by the higher state and federal levels of government. In addition, anti-discrimination laws such as the Fair Housing Act and the Community Reinvestment Act and some analogous state laws have for the most part been weakly enforced by governments. They've depended generally for enforcement on individual action by aggrieved parties themselves, very difficult to do, and more often by advocates through litigation and agitation because of the failures of government to enforce fair housing policy. There are then three areas of housing finance, which I'll just mention to you that I've occupied my work for a long time, that have also contributed to this problem, both in terms of affordability as well as the larger economic problems. The privatization of the public institutions of housing finance that began in the late 60s, two great waves of financial deregulation, first in the Reagan administration and then more recently in the Clinton administration, led, we have to admit, by some of President Obama's top economic advisors. And the third area was loose and expansive monetary policy, all of which contributed to increasing debt burdens, growing opportunities for profit at the top, growing speculation in financial markets, and widening inequality, including all of the consequences for shelter poverty for both homeowners and renters. So, what I'm arguing is that if we are to have any hope of resolving the plight of the shelter poor, we must deal not only with the manifestations, but also with the causes. We must build a house of justice on a solid foundation. And I'm only going to briefly, in the few minutes I have left, identify a few categories of what is actually a more comprehensive program. First, in terms of affordability, I'm proposing the creation of a housing affordability tax credit, patterned somewhat after the earned income tax credit. It would be administered through the Internal Revenue Service, just as EITC is, just as the homeowner benefits are. It would be tenure neutral, available to renters and homeowners. It would be progressive, like EITC. It would decrease with higher incomes and be greater for larger households. But unlike the EITC, you wouldn't lose it if you lose your job, and it would reach higher up the income distribution. It would also be an entitlement, just as the EITC and the homeowner benefits have been, i.e. it would be universal, with no waiting list, no income certification, and so forth. How to pay for it? How could we pay for it in our economy? Well, I would finance this new housing affordability tax credit, about $150 billion a year program, in a way that is budget neutral and would not increase the federal deficit. How? By replacing the homeowner tax benefits and our low-income housing subsidy programs with this single universal housing affordability tax credit. It would reduce both income inequality, thank you, as well as perverse incentives for housing speculation. Second, while the housing affordability tax credit would take us very far toward dealing with shelter poverty, it would not deal with some of the problems on the supply side, namely treating housing as a speculative commodity and the overdependence on debt. So I also have a proposal for expanding the amount of debt-free, non-speculative housing. The most familiar examples, of course, are public housing and nonprofit rental housing in the 202 program, but I'm also proposing the expansion of something called the Mutual Housing Association, a debt-free alternative to home ownership. I can't describe it in detail, but I can tell you that in comparison with conventional home ownership, it offers security and control over your home comparable to ownership, greater security of tenure because there's no mortgage payments, no danger of foreclosure, and in terms of wealth accumulation, comparable in magnitude to owning mortgaged home, but superior in terms of safety and security and liquidity. And final thing, how would I finance this? By a small tax of a few tenths of 1% on all capital market transactions. Stocks, bonds, mortgage-backed securities, and derivatives. A few tenths of a percent, folks, and we could raise a couple of $100 billion a year and expand the amount of debt-free housing by 1 million units a year through new construction, buying existing housing such as foreclosed homes, and saving at-risk subsidized housing. So I'm over time, but just a few words of conclusion. Housing is not only a basic necessity, it has deep importance for so many aspects of our lives. Housing, if it's adequate, provides privacy and security against unwanted intrusions. Where our homes are define our communities and determine our access to jobs, schools, stores, services, and other opportunities. The home is the principal locus of family and personal life. It is here that we first encounter the definitions, expectations, and contradictions of class and race and gender and sexual orientation and physical and mental difference. Our homes contain not only our material possessions, but our dreams and our despair. And yet, despite all of its intimate and profound significance, housing is not assured to all as a matter of right. Rather, it must be purchased as a commodity in the marketplace with income derived, for the most part, from participating in another market. If we are to transcend and overcome the problem of shelter poverty and the larger problems of from which it is spawned, we have to learn, and I hope we can teach others what we already know, that we can only overcome these problems not through the celebration of selfish individualism, but rather through the rediscovery of social responsibility and the transformation of our economic institutions. Thank you.
Another short woman at the podium. This was not built for someone like me. I can barely see you all. Good afternoon. I was bragging earlier that I could get the PowerPoint to work, but there we go. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you, Donna, for all your work and your vision. And it's just really nice to see a lot of people who I've worked with over the last 20 years on virtually every issue we've talked about, both as colleagues as well as some students too. So it's really gratifying and lovely to be here. Thank you. In order to understand, I think, anti-poverty policies for the 21st century, it's worth understanding the policies we have now. And most of the major federal anti-poverty policies that we have in the United States today came to us in mostly two waves. One in the 1930s, the other in the 1960s. Now, not exclusively, but most of the federal anti-poverty policies we have were constructed between the 1930s and 1970s. And I tried to put together 6 of them and give you just a little bit of background of just the programs they are. When it I was reading something about childcare, and the author said, well, we don't really have any childcare programs. We have Head Start. We have childcare funding. And that's true. And the first part of funding was nursery schools with the WPA. So it was a work program for nursery schools, and has moved on, with Head Start being sort of the key childcare program in the 1960s. There's welfare and cash assistance, what we call welfare cash assistance, which was part and parcel of the Social Security Act in 1935. Then was abolished and built upon with TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. Housing assistance programs began with public housing in the 1930s and then expanded to Section 8 in the 70s. The food stamps program, new program in 1964 now, SNAP, Medicaid, 1965, and then a new program added on to Medicaid under the same model, CHIPS, the state children's health insurance program. And while we're talking about Medicaid and CHIP, how many people know Cindy Mann when she was here? And Steve Savner? Okay. Well, Cindy Mann is now the director of Medicaid and CHIPS. She used to work at Mass Law Reform. She used to run, I met Cindy when we worked together at the Tax Reform Commission. So there is hope and a really good administrator. And then the Earned Income Tax Credit in 1975. So that's sort of the landscape of major federal poverty, anti-poverty programs. There are more, LIHEAP and others, but this is where the money is in terms of these programs. Each of these programs were developed pretty much on their own, again, to address poverty, but to address specific poverty-related issues: housing, hunger, child care, et cetera. All of them have different income, asset, work status, and citizen status eligibility rules. Each of them have their own application procedures and reapplication procedures. So we have a fairly large but fragmented and siloed set of anti-poverty programs. But most importantly, I think, these programs reflect mid-20th century employment and labor force patterns, family structures, and community makeup. And actually, it's not just our anti-poverty programs that have this set of understandings in mind. It's also our jobs. There's the labor market assumptions as well as the anti-poverty assumptions, I think, are similar. And I'll talk about why we need to rethink both in a minute. But they assume, to some degree, that most families consist of married couples with one native-born white breadwinner, who's usually a male, and a devoted caregiver. And it also assumes that breadwinners have identifiable employers that provide decent wages and benefits. That is, that most people won't be poor. Why? Because they have units, household units, that can divide the labor of taking care of people in those homes and being a breadwinner, earning income, and that income will be sufficient. That is, the default position around anti-poverty policies is that most people won't be poor. And the reason why most people won't be poor is because they'll have sufficient income. Again, you need an economist to tell you this. And they'll have sufficient income largely through their earnings. So the assumptions around our anti-poverty programs is that the one source of poverty, or how we define poverty, is a lack of income or earnings. And there are certain groups of people that are least likely to have earnings. Well, who are those? Who don't fit the mold? Who do we need poverty policies for? Well, obviously we need them, especially in the 1930s, for single mother families. Mothers weren't expected to work, or they weren't expected to work a lot. People who are disabled, or have impediments, physical or mental or other kinds of disabilities that don't allow for full-time employment or allow for earnings. Elders, people who are retired. And there's also some understanding that there will be some part of the population in the United States, has specifically been rural or urban poor, who would be left behind in economic growth, in acquiring sufficient earnings. So poverty policies have been geared towards those populations, largely because they were assumed to not have either earnings or the family structure or the right privileged race, et cetera, to enable them to have access to earnings. There's also ideological assumptions, and those have been touched upon today about poverty and poverty policies. And those concern about why people are poor, why don't they have earnings, what should families look like, and who of our families should deserve to be supported. And we clearly have, and have had at least in the United States, this bifurcation of deserving poor versus non-deserving poor. And the deserving poor we think of as people who are poor for no fault of their own. And as I say, who are those usual suspects? Widows, Although I guess we could assume that they might have killed their husbands, but we won't go there. Actually, Arthur brought up to me, how about unmarried women? I said, no, you haven't read the debates because all the debates blame women for their husbands leaving them. So widows specifically, elders, disabled, and short-term unemployed. And indeed, as Hubie pointed out this morning, in fact, we do have anti-poverty programs for that group. They tend to be universal, and then they tend to pay higher benefits. And Social Security, which is part and parcel, old age and survivor of disability insurance, is part and parcel of the same bill that brought us AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. So it was all conceived of together, as was unemployment insurance. Now, unemployment insurance only covers those assumed breadwinners that had identifiable employers that I talked about before. But we do have anti-poverty programs. So these programs were set up to stave off poverty among this group. And again, they were more universal than the ones we have now. Then we have what is considered less deserving poor. And this is the big poverty debate. You just brought this up, Melinda, this debate that we have. Oh, and the usual suspects for the less deserving poor are unmarried single mothers, for whatever reason, long-term poor, those stuck in quote-unquote culture of poverty, those facing racial and ethnic and gender barriers to education, training, and employment. So it's that same group that's not going to have earnings, but these, we call into question the deservingness of their poverty. And the big debate resolves exactly around what you said. Are they personally responsible for their own poverty-producing behaviors? Or there's these structural barriers or discrimination that preclude the chance to make earnings. And also this notion that these severe, you don't even have to, I don't think you have to necessarily believe in the structural barriers, but I do think you have to believe that there are severe economic consequences for those individual choices, and that those consequences wouldn't happen to Chuck because or his family, because the same sets of adversity can come down the same path. The question is, what kinds of resources do you have to deal with it, and what are the consequences of those things that come in front of your path? So I think those are sort of the things that we wrangle with. And what are the policies for the less deserving? Well, certainly meager benefits, and they are structured so as to discourage the behaviors we think produce poverty. And the two I put in here are non-marriage and non-employment. But there's other sets of behaviors we like to discourage. They address the specific needs, as I mentioned. They're means tested. That is, they're really mean. No, they're only available to those with very low income. They actually happen to also, some of them, be mean, in the sense that they are stigmatized and sometimes fragmented. So we have the poverty policies, but the ones we think of as poverty policies are these narrower sets that are well funded in some degree, although not sufficient. But they're also built on a foundation of non-employment. For example, food stamps, the benefits are based on a budget of only home-cooked meals that take hours to cook. Head Start is a good example. It wants and encourages parents' participation during the day. Okay? Medicaid and TANF phase out really quickly, Medicaid for adults, phase out very quickly at extremely low wages. So you don't have to have much employment to lose those. Housing assistance, TANF, food stamps, and child care assistance have very steep phase outs for earned income. And anyone who's applied for these knows that it takes a long time to apply for, recertify, and they usually require several face-to-face encounters with the caseworkers or administrators to do it. So this is not for the meek and the mild. These programs require a good bit of time, and they assume that you're not going to be employed. Assume differently. Are we a nation of mostly, and here come the numbers. I usually don't like to give a lot of numbers, but I actually found that you could get the 1930 census online. It's like a dream come true for someone like me. Numbers. Percent of all households that are married couples. Actually, there's an interesting pattern, actually. What you can see is 1930, 79%, 1960, even higher percent. That's the Leave It to Beaver time, right? Right? But today, 50% of households are married households. 50% are not. So 50% of households in the United States are largely comprised of one adult who's taking care of him or herself and maybe some other children. Percent of households with kids that are in married couple families. Again, the same kind of trend. In 1960, 93%, today 71%. Native born, white, not quite. 1990, you can see the numbers. From 1940, 88%, today 60% of the population is white, non-Hispanic. Percent foreign-born population actually hasn't changed much. It dipped in the 60s and it's gone up, but the percentage of foreign-born population that is white has halved. Male breadwinners. Percent of all households that are female-headed, again, I said 50% are married couples, 30% now are female-headed, compared to 8% in the 1930s. Percent of women 16 years old and older that are employed, you can see it's more than doubled since the 1930s. And then this number, they didn't have this in the 1930 census. I don't know why. Percent contribution of wives' earnings to families' income is about a third. So of those 50% of households that are married, wives are making significant contributions. And then of the 30% that are female in households, of course, they're making significant contributions. Good jobs, good wages. This probably has, Arthur's advice was write too many numbers. But this is just to give you some sense. The percentage of jobs that pay at least $17 an hour have employer-sponsored health insurance and employer-sponsored retirement plans. If we look at all jobs today, less than a quarter of all jobs have that, and it's declined slightly. Actually, there's sort of an interesting dynamic going on. It's really declined for men having those three components and increased slightly for women. But as you can see, about 20% of the jobs that women have, 20% of women have jobs with all three components versus 27% for men. And then the bottom panel is the jobs that don't have any of those three. And again, it's a higher percentage that don't have those employer-sponsored benefits or a decent wage than do. So, what do we need for 21st century families, communities, and jobs? Well, I think I can't talk about this today, but those same assumptions about white breadwinner males with sufficient jobs also help structure the labor market. And we don't have those kinds of jobs, we don't have that kind of labor market. So I think one way to reduce poverty is to improve earnings. I agree with that analysis that we will help people off, but we will reduce poverty by increasing income. Well, it's just, we need caseworkers, we need other things, but we need income, okay? And the main source of income is earnings. And the way that we improve earnings for workers is that we make work better. And I was happy to see Enid here today talking largely to the group of people that work on poverty, because we need unions, or we need people who are organizing workers, and they need us for precisely the reasons that I think Enid laid out today. That is that the group, the labor force that's not terribly organized, that doesn't have good, decent work employment conditions, including wages, are the jobs in which are service-oriented and are care-oriented. And what's that, 5 minutes? Okay. So we need universal employment, not employer-based standards for all workers that can accommodate today's workforce. That is, all workers need some paid time off. And they need it for sick days, either for themselves or their children, and it's for extended leaves that are necessary, family and medical leave. Some workers have it, some workers don't. We need existing labor laws that are enforced, and are expanded to cover virtually all workers. That means unemployment insurance, health and safety rules, hours and wage standards. We need a living minimum wage, whatever that is, and if health care is provided for all, that wage can be lower. We also need to understand that many workers, particularly low-income mothers, are not going to be able to work for full-time. So we need prorated employer-sponsored benefits for part-time workers. And I actually agree with Enid. I think the best vehicle for getting this stuff is through unions, and that currently the Employee Free Choice Act, which I think many of us that work on poverty issues don't think is our issue, it is our issue. Because it's only through the ability of workers to be able to improve their standards that I think will actually make a dent in reducing poverty. We also need universal public standards for all residents, and I didn't say citizens, to accommodate today's families and community needs. And I put 3 of them down. One is affordable basic health care coverage. You need to know that you're insured if something happens to you. We also need what I'm calling adequately supported care work. And that includes K through 12 education, health care, and direct care of young children, disabled, and elders. This is not something that we can rely on the private sector to provide. And when they do provide it, they only provide it for those who can afford it. So as a minimum and as a universal, this is the message from Margaret this morning, we need these universal programs that cover the sets of care work. We also need affordable public higher education for everyone in the United States. We also need to modernize, so those were universal programs, but there will still be poor people. And so we still need to modernize, quote unquote, Obama loves to say 21st century policies for the 21st century. Well, let's talk about 21st century poverty policies. And we need to modernize those policies. And some of us in this room have been working on that. That includes streamlining the processes for applying, addressing these issues of falling off cliffs or losing these benefits as you do what you're supposed to do, which is to get a job. Work to push the federal government to increase income eligibility, and to recognize that unpaid care work is work, and that it limits paid work, and we need to structure our federal poverty policies that recognizes that. I mean, I guess I could suggest we just dismantle them all and build them up again, but I'm too afraid. So, finally, how do we, paying, you can see I have this paying for inequality or paying for equality. I would add to what Chuck has said, our current sets of policies are very costly. And they're mostly now costly to the families who are bearing, individual families at the bottom, who are forced to bear the cost of those. But they cost all of us over the long run. They increase, as you said before, health. I'm convinced if Boston can address the issue of poverty, we can solve Boston public schools problems. I think we have to call the problem of public schools a problem of poverty. And it's very costly, not just for those families, but for Boston as a city, for the Commonwealth. And public safety costs. We know that inequality creates a lot more of both domestic violence as well as neighborhood violence, et cetera. And it's expensive for all of us. We need to, I'm a researcher, I have to put my role here. We have to continue to document that. But nothing comes without an organized fight. So I think we need campaigns, and Hubie talked about this earlier, that we assure that we have current adequate funding structures, because those sets of public, the care goods and public education and healthcare have to be financed through the government sector. It's not going to happen any other way, and we need adequate and fair funding to do that, just to echo what Chuck said too. But we also need campaigns and to get behind the campaigns that make sure that labor laws and practices are adequate to the task, so that people can, in fact, be assured that if they do find a job and get employed, that their earnings will be somewhat sufficient for staving off poverty. That's it.